There. All right, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Culture Goes Pop. I'm Scott Wilson, and I'm joined by
Steve Strobridge.
Or vice versa. He's Scott Wilson, and I'm Steve Strobridge. We're here for another episode. We've got an interesting topic. This was your idea, Scott, so why don't you set the stage? What are we going to talk about today, depending on when people are listening to us?
Well, tonight we're going to talk about the aftermath, and I don't mean Dr. Dre's label. I am talking about what happens when geek properties and this renaissance we've been going through roughly, I'd say, definitely the last decade and change, but even longer than that, where superhero movies are all the rage, where it seems like everybody watches Dragon Ball Z. It seems like everybody has Funko Pops on their desk in the cubicles at work, where all of the things that used to be considered geeky at one point in time became chic. What happens when all of that is over? What happens when corporate America realizes there's no longer as much money in being a geek or catering to geeks as there once was? What do us geeks who were geeks before being a geek became chic? What do we do when being a geek is no longer chic? And sorry, I know how corny that all just sounded, but it's what came to mind. So,
it reminds me of a Rick James song. You're a super geek, you're super chic and yow. Geek and chic. So, to paraphrase, it seems like, and we have some articles here that we're going to talk about that fed into this, it feels like we could be on the cusp or the verge of the bubble bursting. It seems like Marvel's superhero movies, the MCU, which kicked off with pretty much Iron Man, the first Iron Man. And even before then, I would contribute even the original X-Men run that came from Fox with Hugh Jackman as Wolverine and Professor X, Patrick Stewart. I think that kickstarted superheroes. They showed the world that live-action superhero movies, can be entertaining, and can be financially viable. And then, of course, we had, through the 2000s, we had the whole Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. We had a slew of superhero movies that were, not really, there's no continuity between them, but they were definitely, most of them were pretty decent, especially the Spider-Man run. And then we have the MCU, which just kind of set a whole new precedence for superhero movies dominating the box office, dominating merchandising, toys, clothes, collectibles, T-shirts, movies, video game tie-ins, you name it. It's been an enterprise. It's been a phenomenon. It's been going on for, it feels like 15 years. And it seems like there's no end in sight. However, I don't remember the exact episode, but we did ask this question early on in our run of this podcast. Was Disney Plus giving us too much? You and I were already asking ourselves, are we getting to be oversaturated? One of the articles that you brought to us from the Hollywood Reporter is about Bob Iger, is he the current CEO or president of Disney? I'm not sure. He's a bigwig at Disney. And he's talking about specifically focusing on quality over quantity. A lot of this had to do specifically with Star Wars, but to another degree, Marvel properties as well. And I, when Disney Plus came out, it was exciting. It was kind of like, what it reminded me of? Do you remember when Fox TV first came out? and Fox was this underdog network, and they were just experimental, and they were just doing innovative stuff. This is where like In Living Color came from, and Parker Lewis Can't Lose, and God Bless You, Inside Herman's Head, and all these really weird, and Married with Children, really cool, innovative stuff came from the Fox network when they first came out, because they were the underdog, and they're like, hey, listen, we got to compete with the big three. We're going to just do stuff. Disney Plus kind of felt like that. Of course, they had a big catalog of your Disney properties, your Pixar and Star Wars and existing Marvel stuff, but then they started doing a lot of experimental stuff, live action stuff. The Mandalorian, which in my opinion, huge hit. Andor, right? But they give us a lot of live action Marvel stuff too. So we have, I don't know how many I can't even count all the live action series, but there's Hawkman, Hawkeye, Falcon and Winter Soldier, WandaVision, Loki, Miss Marvel, Moon Knight. What else am I missing?
Oh boy.
That's at least a half a dozen live action. She-Hulk, that's 7. Yeah. There might be more, but at least 7.
Is What If?
What If? So a bunch of, what not live action, but still series. So over 7 series of stuff. And if you're a fan, you can say, man, this is a great time to be a fan of superhero content. But if you're a discerning person, you could say, wow, there's a lot of superhero content. How do I cut through all this? It's a good problem to have, but it's a problem. So I think that's kind of the gist of what we're talking about here. There's an old saying that if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And there hasn't been an industry that hasn't had some type of crash. The video game industry had the big crash in 1983, where there was a time where they lost focus on the quality and just said, let's do quantity. And they just thought that they were printing money by just releasing new titles. And everybody got in on the action. There was oversaturation. And then everybody just kind of threw their hands up in the air and said, enough, we're done. Screw video games, right? So there was the video game crash of 83. Talked about the movie studio crash of 1960. You brought that up.
Well, a lot of movie buffs and cinephiles know about this, but in the late 1960s, what they call the big studio system experienced a crash in that the genres and things that had been making money for them for decades, musicals, westerns, that kind of genre entertainment, it was no longer in vogue. The country was going through all kinds of upheaval on many different fronts. So the Vietnam War was happening. Leaders were getting killed all through the 60s. Civil rights leaders were getting killed. All kinds of leaders were getting killed.
And JFK
and that kind of... And
Martin Luther King.
Some of those things brought about changes in and of themselves. But then you began to see a change in what people wanted to see, or just how they wanted to see it. And the movie industry, which was mired in tradition and nepotism and all kinds of other things, just wasn't ready to change with the times, so to speak. So they experienced a bit of a crash. Now, what that did from the late 60s to the mid 70s, there was a brief period of time where filmmakers themselves had more control. Now, out of this period came some of the greatest movies ever that anybody had ever seen. There's a book called Easy Riders, Raging Bulls that details this whole thing and the filmmakers that came out of it. Easy Rider by Dennis Hopper. Warren Beatty is one of the names that came from that time or came to prominence during that time. Scorsese, a lot of big names, and these guys did very gritty, very personal films that played with sort of, and there was a newfound freedom because now you had the ratings, the MPA or the MPAA as was known back then implemented the ratings code, and now filmmakers had more freedom on what they could show, and these new films that came out from the late 60s to the mid 70s reflected a younger sensibility, a different way of looking at the world. Taxi Driver is one of the main examples of that, where you have a movie that focuses on a character that is basically psychotic, and he's going through the red light district of New York, and the whole movie he's just this ticking time bomb, and it ends with a massacre at a brothel where he saves a 13-year-old prostitute. The language in the film is like nothing that you nothing that people had heard until that era. The themes that it deals with and the way it dealt with those themes. Now these movies were great, but that era was brought to an end in the mid '70s, and that was mainly because of what they called the blockbuster was taking shape, and then you had Jaws come out in 1975. But even before Jaws, there were signs of it. The Exorcist, The Godfather, these movies that became water cooler conversation. But it wasn't until Jaws and Star Wars that the movie industry now had a new formula to get to a version of what it once was. Now, I say all of that whole long-winded spiel to say this. Everything crashes sooner or later, as Steve said. The renaissance, the geek renaissance, the geek chic renaissance that we've been having for a decade and change will eventually come to an end in some way. Does that mean that superhero movies will completely disappear? Superhero media will completely disappear? Movies about video games will completely disappear? Blah, 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 blah. Harry Potter. All that. No, likely they won't. These things have been prominent for too long at this point that they'll completely go away, but they won't always be the biggest thing out there. Something else. Or a new version of these things that us dyed-in-the-wool geeks, us older geeks, aren't familiar with or friendly toward will come and take its. That's more than likely. That's what'll happen. There will be something that's kind of like Star Wars, but not Star Wars, and we're going to resent that, and we're not going to like it. But a whole new generation of people will. Same thing for Marvel. But what do we do? My question. It comes down to the question: What do you do when you're no longer the cool kid at school, the cool new guy? What do you do?
So this is a hypothetical. Let's say that there was that the bubble bursts and Warner Brothers, DCU, MCU, they just stop making movies altogether. That's the worst case scenario. I don't predict that happening. Maybe some variant of that might happen.
Well, they may have to downsize. They may have to.
So if the constant flow of mainstream Marvel movies goes from a flow to a trickle, and it's almost like an addict, almost like, Pookie, right? Chris Rock. That should be calling me, man, right? So you're used to getting your fix, right? If you can't get that steady fix, what are you going to do? Is that the question?
Well, yeah. What are you going to do? But also, just how are you going to deal with it? Because it's geeks. Like even on this show, I tend to be very analytical. I tend to pick things apart in a way that sometimes people might find annoying. I don't really care because that's me. Deal with it.
How many F's are given, Scott?
None.
0 F's given. Here's the F meter. Currently holding it at 0.
But there is a sort of there is a different side to that too, because I do realize it's easy to complain when the table is full. It's easy to easy to complain about what it's easy to complain about.
Oh my God, there's so much food on this table. I mean, really, come on. Yeah. People are starving in the world.
And then when you're one of the people who are starving in the world, then you're like, wow, I remember this table used to be full.
Yeah.
But it's just all in how you, because we've seen this happen with things, and one thing, my own personal journey, because I'll talk briefly about when I've had some.
Should I play some like Torchlight piano sad?
No, not even
background
sad
music or anything. Okay.
Not even sad. It's just an example of how things are dealt with. I remember when the Star Wars prequels were about to come out, and I was so excited because I was 19. No, I was 22. Okay. I was 22 when Phantom Menace was going to come out, and I was like, Star Wars back then was something sacred to me.
Yes.
It was like,
Yes. Yeah, it was the Holy Trinity.
And but that whole era, what Lucas and Spielberg represented, I felt like nothing was like being a kid when you would go to the movie theater and there'd be lines around the block and it felt like the whole world was into it.
Yeah.
Now, and then the Phantom Menace comes out, and that year, although it made more money than this particular film, there was another film that sort of eclipsed it in terms of being chic or being the next big thing, and that was The Matrix.
The Matrix, Neo.
And I resented The Matrix because of that, because I felt like it stole Star Wars thunder.
Honestly, I wasn't. I'm nowhere near as analytical as you, but I am a super fan on certain things. And although I've been a super fan of Star Wars, I didn't see another great movie came out that year too, the X-Files movie, because X-Files was a huge
That was the year
thing.
before. Actually,
Okay,
that
yeah,
was not
but
the
in that same kind of time frame. I didn't see that as a resentment at all. I just thought, wow, these are two great movies to be a super nerd.
Oh, I mean, me personally, like, and
So you resented the fact that it did better.
well, it was just that it stole the thunder, and and for the first time, it made me confront the fact that while Star Wars may be timeless, it was no longer timely. It was that now things that have been it had inspired things, as Vader said. I am. Last time we met, I was but the learner, but now I am
Now
the
I'm the
master.
master, right?
And then that got sort of compounded when a few years later, when Lord of the Rings came out. Lord of the Rings really kind of took the thunder of the prequel trilogy in a way that just really annoyed the hell out of me, because, and even online when you went to forums like Ain't It Cool News, you could see fandoms sort of drawing lines in the sand and like kind of going at. Now, of course, here's the thing: I liked The Matrix, even as I resented it. I still liked it.
It was a good movie. I was blown away.
Lord of the Rings, I've always respected and appreciated it more than I've enjoyed it. It's just not, those films just aren't my cup of tea. Like, I didn't grow up reading the books, which I did read halfway through the trilogy. I respect them. I respect the influence they had. I respect that without Tolkien, there would be no Star Wars trilogy. There would, a lot of the things that I grew to like came from.
Right.
But those things,
And anybody who's a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, like,
Yeah.
which I am as a kid, going back to like the '70s, everything about Dungeons and Dragons was pulled from Tolkien. All the characters and classes and races and everything was pulled from Tolkien.
But
Yeah.
one thing that experience taught me, it sort of taught me early on. Well, not early on, but I kind of got a glimpse of, no matter how big something is, and Star Wars is arguably, that might be the biggest movie ever. Not in terms of raw grosses, raw unadjusted grosses, but just in terms of the phenomenon that it was and what it sort of did. Both that and Jaws, and then, like I said, also The Exorcist, because they always leave out those early '70s, The Exorcist, The Godfather. There were other films that kind of preceded Jaws and Star Wars that kind of gave you a glimpse of,
Right.
okay, the new blueprint is coming together. It's coming together because The Exorcist, if you look at how much money that thing made and adjusted for inflation, like even now, I think it's probably the highest grossing R-rated flick. There's not going to be another horror film that's probably ever going to sell more tickets than The Exorcist. Or Jaws, if you consider Jaws a horror film. But and like when I say tickets sold, go to Box Office Mojo and you'll see the adjusted chart. I think they might still have that. They used to have that before. And I mean, it's just like Star Wars, Going with the Wind. Those things, you'll never unseat them.
Okay.
In terms of tickets.
Yeah, you know what always annoyed me too is like, the benchmark, like the Beatles were the biggest group ever. And so whenever you get some new pop star, diva, boy band, whatever,
They always try
and
to
they start
compare
to
it.
say, oh, we're selling more things than the Beatles. Well, there's so many things that you have to take in consideration. Not only are you adjusting for the rate of inflation, but the thing is that in the
The way we listen to music is different
The way
now.
we listen to music is different. The
Yeah.
financial wherewithal of the average American. It wasn't like everybody could just buy whatever they wanted at any given time. There wasn't digital distribution. It wasn't all these different things. So we were a smaller, less financially endowed country. There were fewer people in the world, and there were fewer outlets for different things. So the fact that the Beatles are still kind of the benchmark for what a supergroup is, and based on talent, not just based on being thrown together by a
Right.
producer, there's never going to be another Beatles. But I always like when they take some established status quo of this is what success was. Oh, we're better than that. It's just you can't compare.
No.
Yeah, I mean. So and there was, and I think another thing too is it has to do with the frequency of the release of these things. Where when Star Wars first came out, we had to wait an average of at least 2 years, 2 to 3
It was
years,
3 years, every 3 years.
between movies. So and there wasn't as much access to seeing it again at home. Home video, especially on the bigger blockbuster stuff, wasn't quite there yet. So when you saw a movie in the theater, you had to see it a whole bunch of times in the theater,
Yes.
and then basically burned it into your brain
And
cells.
then VHS and cable changed that.
And then then you had to buy all the magazines and all the books and everything else, and you had to continue to sustain that interest through a lot of other avenues, because it wasn't like there was a new, it's not like the streaming stuff now where almost you get a whole season at once or you get a new episode every week and all this other kind of stuff. So Star Wars, the pacing of it, it was not only incredible quality entertainment. When I say Star Wars, I'm talking about the first three Star Wars movies going back to 77. Not only was the quality there and it was a life-changing, game-changing movie, but the pacing of it coming out every 2 to 3 years really kept people engaged in what was here, and then just really couldn't wait for the next one, because each one seemed to one up the last one, which really seemed hard to do. So there was something about that too, that formula and that time release way of doing things. And that way of doing things was because that's literally how long things took. Now, do you remember a car called Saturn? Remember the Saturn? Saturn introduced something that was called just in time, where everything was happening right when you needed it. And so they were able to build these things off of the assembly line, and things were able to move very quickly in a continual flow. And we're now in the just-in-time era of content, between movies and between streaming services and the multiple streaming networks that we have. And even when with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they were still releasing a movie per year, because they had lots of movies in works at the same time. So while they're doing Iron Man, they're also working on a Thor movie or a Captain America movie or something else. So different directors, different casts, different locations. So they were kind of just in time again, working on a lot of these movies simultaneously in order to have that kind of once a year release schedule, which is different now than it was in the 70s, because they got a hell of a lot more money now. So again, the world's different than it was a few years ago.
Well, it's also now because these things are corporate product in a way that they never were before. I think throughout the 90s, and maybe even a little bit before that, but back in the 70s when Star Wars was out, the American movie industry was not as concerned with international box office as they are now, to the point where a lot of Star Wars movies in China, the original trilogy did not play on screens when it was released. It didn't, and it's also something that Star Wars fans don't get. Marvel is much bigger than Star Wars ever was on a worldwide scale. Star Wars is more of a phenomenon in the Western world. But even then, it created the template for what the MCU now is. But like, my thing is just, it'll be interesting to see how geeks deal with it. And the one genre I can think of is a genre that superhero films always get compared to, but it's not really a good comparison. If you look at the history of this genre, it's not a good. They always make one-to-one comparisons with superheroes and westerns.
Okay.
Not really. If you look at what a western actually is and what constitutes a western, and superheroes movies aren't really a genre anyway, but that's a whole other topic. They don't really because especially with Marvel, there's so many things that go under the superhero quote unquote umbrella.
Right. It's a blockbuster, movie that happens to be dealing with heroes ripped from comic pages, comic book pages.
It's like, but what I mean is, the Western fell out of favor. I've read different takes on when exactly it fell out of favor, but it was like, I've read that in the 50s it fell out of favor, but it was actually in the late 60s, maybe, I don't know. But at some point in time, the traditional Western was no longer.
You're talking about like the John Wayne era?
Well, just what you think.
And then, or like the Clint Eastwood. Like John Wayne was like the 50s, Clint Eastwood was like the 60s and 70s.
Well, the thing is, Clint Eastwood represents the different kind of Western that came out of.
Right.
What happened was, I'm talking about the typical golden era Hollywood Western.
Right.
But then you started to get in the late 60s, and in like, at some point you got what's called revisionist Westerns. These Westerns were gritty. I think, and if we have any listeners who are movie buffs who can correct me, please feel free, because I don't know everything. There's a whole ton of things I don't know.
Wait a second, Scott Wilson doesn't know everything?
Yeah, imagine the thought. But these westerns, I think some of it was spurred on by the early spaghetti westerns that Eastwood did with Sergio Leone. Because if you look at those movies, people have bad skin and cracked lips, sun damaged skin and lips. They have 5 o'clock shadows. The movies are more violent.
They look
Often
like real cowboys. They look like they're living on the land.
Often they're sweaty.
Yeah.
I mean, you see actual blood when people get shot. And also like there's no real good guys in some of those early spaghetti. The Dollars trilogy,
Okay.
Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, by the great Sergio Leone. But then you start to get guys like Sam Peckinpah, who took partial inspiration from those spaghetti westerns. But Sam Peckinpah is a name. If you watch action movies in the 70s and 80s, if you ever saw a movie with guys having a shootout and then slow motion occurs, Sam Peckinpah is the guy that perfected that.
Okay. Before bullet time in the Matrix.
He did a movie called The Wild Bunch that is
Okay.
still a very, very rough watch. That movie has basically outlaws in the West using women as human shields from bullets. It was
Controversial?
that movie was very Sam was not shy to controversy. He came about 1969 is when that film was released, and it's a masterpiece. It's bloody, it's gritty, and it's about basically these aging outlaws, these guys who are in I think maybe their 40s or 50s or just, but they're in the early 1900s, and their time is coming to perfect theme. Their time is coming to. They see that America is evolving. They see the first cars and things, and they realize the way we've been living is not going to last too much longer. And the movie, spoiler alert, but this is out there everywhere now. All of them die in the end, and what was probably one of the first bloody extended shootouts in Hollywood history. But when you see it, you realize how much it's been ripped off. But you got a lot of westerns like that. You got High Plains Drifter from Clint Eastwood, another very dark western where this ghost of a lawman who was betrayed by his town comes back to avenge. Again, very gritty. One of the best revisionist westerns is the one that Eastwood finally won Best Picture and Best Director for, was Unforgiven. And if you see that film, it gives you a good idea. But and I'm waiting for the point when superhero movies finally they've tried to do it, but when you start to see these revisionist superhero movies, they sort of look at the genre.
For people like me and other people, when you say revisionist, explain to me what that means, because I hear it, but I'm not quite sure I know what that
You're
means.
looking at the same material, but revising. You're looking at it, but through a different lens.
Okay.
In these movies, the gunslingers and the cowboys aren't necessarily heroes. They're not squeaky clean. We see Unforgiven. I don't know how well you remember that film.
Yeah, basically he was a retired gunslinger, but his history was he killed a lot of people.
He killed women and children.
He hung up his hat, hung up his gun. He was retired. I'm not going to kill anymore. And then which is basically like John Wick, right? I'm retired. I'm done. But somehow somebody drags me back into the shenanigans, so now I have to F everybody up until there's no more people that I just want to relax, dude. I want to be retired. You F'd with me. You F'd with the town. You killed my best friend, who was Morgan Freeman, of all people. Don't F with Morgan Freeman, or Clint Eastwood will come and F you up.
The thing that's funny about that movie, I saw that when I was about 16 going on 17. And the funny thing about that movie, that was one of the first revenge movies or what have you that I saw.
It ain't easy killing a man. Take away everything he's ever got, anything he's ever going to have.
But where the bad guy gets, where the quote unquote, William Money, the main character, is a bad guy. But when Gene Hackman gets killed in the end, it doesn't leave you with a good feeling. You feel like you just watched basically people get slaughtered and something horrible took place. You saw this guy who had civilized himself. He got married and had kids, and you saw him regress. One of the best things in the movie, he tells there's a guy going along with them, the Schofield kid,
The kid, yeah.
who
yeah.
wants to be like him, and he
Right.
tells, and when the Schofield kid is asking him, hey, how'd you feel when you were doing all that stuff? He said, well, most of the time we were drunk.
Right.
Right before he goes to avenge Morgan Freeman,
Right.
he grabs some whiskey from
Right,
the kid,
because
and
he
you
was
see
dry.
and you see him drinking.
Yeah.
But then and that's when you realize you don't in that scene you don't feel charged up. You feel like, oh my God, this guy's
Yeah.
gonna go slaughter a bunch of people.
Yeah.
But but that's revisionist. Clint Eastwood is taking something he'd done 100 times before.
Okay.
But he's sort of looking at it from a different. What if we really looked at these guys for who they were and what they actually
Right,
did?
and not just the Hollywood black hat, white hat, right? So,
Yeah, and
the good guys wore the white hats, the bad guys wore the black hats. That's just how traditional westerns were, right?
yeah.
No, I get that. I get that.
But anyway, it just gives you an idea. All these revisionists, it gives you an idea of what happens when these things sort of hit a slump, and they can't figure out a way to squeeze money out of them. And that's one thing that happens. You get revisionist versions of these genres. You get deconstructionists. That's another word. Deconstructionists. You deconstruct films that deconstruct the genre.
Okay.
An example of that, a good example of that's already been done with superheroes and superhero movies. Even Alan Moore's Watchmen.
Okay.
And
I was almost going to say Deadpool. You're going to say Deadpool because he breaks the fourth wall and kind of makes fun of a lot of stuff too. But yeah, The Watchmen, right? Because and also The Boys. The Boys
Yes.
on it's Amazon Prime. I was going to say Hulu. I can't keep
superheroes have been deconstructed so much now. It's almost become a cliche into itself. And I always get annoyed when we get them so early because I keep thinking one of the reasons the revisionist westerns, some of them were so effective, was because they came technically at the end of the genre. They came when the genre was no longer in favor, so you understood a little bit better. Oh, okay, I see what's happening here. But with superheroes, the superhero boom was technically started with X-Men and Spider-Man just after Blade came out.
Right, which most people don't realize, at least at that time, that Blade is a Marvel character, and that was a Marvel movie, even though it was R-rated. And that, honestly, that first Blade movie is my favorite. And I know they're going to recast him, and I'm sure with all the money and talent and stuff they have with writing, directing, etc., it's going to be a good movie. But to me, almost like that first Blade movie is like the first Star Wars. It is so Holy Trinity to me that even like the 2 and 3, the Blade sequels were all good, but the first one was the best. 'Cause again, and I don't remember the year it came out, but again, it was kind of like The Matrix, where it had martial arts, it had computer animation, visual effects, and a cool techno soundtrack. It was just the trifecta of badassery.
It sort of was a precursor to The Matrix. It did,
yeah.
It did a lot. It did some of the same things before
everybody
The Matrix
wore
did.
cool. Like he had the leather trench coat, and everybody looked cool, stylistic. We're all dressing up like some fashionitas, and we got the cool techno soundtrack, and we all kick ass.
but again, it's just I just wonder what, like I said, when the bubble bursts, just what it will be like, what it will be like, because one thing I have seen, in the midst of the MCU really putting a period on the end of the sentence, kind of saying this will be the most popular thing there is right now,
whether you like it or not.
I've seen a lot of geeks our age lamenting, hey, when I was in high school, I used to get beat up for reading comics, and people made fun of me.
But now everybody's doing it.
Yeah, my life was made pretty miserable because I was just a geek, and but now all the things that I like, I see that have become all the rage, and that's a whole other show. That's a whole other thing to put on the therapist's couch right there.
Right.
That's a whole other show, but it does, again, it begs the same question: what happens when suddenly you walk into that same bar that you go to every Friday night that's always jam packed? You go in there one night, and then all you notice there's less people, and every time you go in, you notice there's even less people, people.
Yeah, and so that can be true for any type of local establishment, a bar, a restaurant, coffee shop, right, donut shop. You rely on your patronage, and at some point in time, you see this. It keeps rising. Oh my God, I'm making more money. It's never going to end, and you never plan for that. You just keep assuming that this needle's going to keep going. but that's just not good sense. And again, earlier in the show, I talked about how we had the video game crash. So we had that back in 2008. We had a real estate crash, right, where the prices
Right.
of homes kept getting overinflated, and people were signing loans for people who weren't qualified for these loans. All these
The
problems.
music industry had a crash in the mid
Yeah.
2000s with the advent of the internet and the
Like
crash of
your
the CD market. You know,
And
like
the whole Napster music sharing thing, Napster and LimeWire.
physical media has crashed big time over
Right.
the past 10 to 20 years. I mean, so so we're in a space now where here's what let me offer, because we've been going for 35 minutes now, so I think at this point we need to sort of look at the other side, get to the other side of this
Yeah, okay.
question. Here's what I think will happen, much like what happened with the big studio crash. Like I said, from the late 60s to mid 70s, you got some of the most amazing and memorable American films, to the point where a lot of cinephiles and movie buffs consider the 70s. And when they talk about the 70s, they're talking about, like I say, 1967 or 68 till about 74 as being the greatest period of American film, just because it was almost like you were free of the constraints of having to answer to these corporate benefactors to the same degree, and you just got to kind of see what was on these artists' minds and what they had to say about us, and I think that here's what's going to happen when the crash inevitably happens. Yeah, it's going to be a little sad, because you're going to see Marvel downsize quite a bit, and it's going to turn into a trickle. But I think it will also allow for more chances to be taken, especially if you get younger voices in there who have some different ideas. Hey, I like superheroes too, and I grew up. Sooner or later, that's going to happen. Some guy that's about half my age probably is going to come along and say, hey, I love this stuff. I grew up on it too, but here's what I have to say about this stuff, or what I can say with it.
Right.
Or here's what I think
Right.
it's been missing, because that excuse me, that's what always tends to happen, and it's going to be and we're going to see a reflection of what we like, but it's probably not going to be in the way that we're used to, and that's going to give a lot of us problems, and we're going to probably miss some of the greatness. I already know that's because that's always what happens.
Okay.
You're going to miss some of the greatness initially, because you can't see. My father, who grew up on westerns, a lot of those revisionist westerns, he wasn't really too. I had to convince him to like the Wild Bunch, because he saw it. That came out.
Yeah. Sometimes we look through a lens, and we're looking through our own myopic lens of, I know how I liked things. This is not how I like things. It's hard for me to open up the iris of this lens to see more of the picture. I'm really, kind of macro photography, zooming in on the fact that this is not what
Right.
I'm used to, and I can't look
And-
at a bigger picture. I think we're all guilty of that in some area of my life.
And I think and people, I think it's probably going to happen sooner rather than later. Just to bring in some of the articles we've been talking about. Last year was the first time that in a few years where MCU film, a Marvel Cinematic Universe film, was not the highest grossing film at either the domestic or the worldwide box office. That in 2022, that space was taken by both Top Gun Maverick and Avatar: The Way of Water. So that's sort of a break in the recent precedent that Marvel has set. And then when you couple that with the fact that Ant-Man Quantumania is underperforming, I read that it may not make 500 million worldwide. That's not a good sign. That's and then also Kevin Feige announced, I think he did, that he is going to be downsizing or scaling back on the Marvel content on Disney Plus. And then you have Bob Iger making these announcements. And then you have Funko, who is about to basically bury or dump.
They're pulling a ET cartridge, right? Which is what happened. We're talking about the video game crash of 1983, and one of the most infamous video games was from the Atari video computer system, or also known as Atari 2600. But ET was the game that was overhyped, became less than people were less than enamored with it when it first came out. And so it kind of was the nail in the coffin. And then Atari ended up taking hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of these units, burying them in a landfill out in Arizona somewhere just to get rid of them, to get them out of the market, to not screw up the market. And sadly, this is also what happens when you buy certain breed pets, especially like I used to hear the horror stories. Like if you don't buy a pet from the pet stores in the mall, because they always want puppies, and if those puppies don't sell, they get killed. You know what I mean? This is the horror stories you heard about. So everyone's like, buy an animal from a shelter, right? So this is kind of what's happening. You have all this product, and in order to keep the market going, we don't want to give these purebred things to a shelter for people to get for $20 from so we're going to kill them off. Now they have all this product, they're just going to literally throw it away, because if you undersell it and you give it to whatever, then you've devalued what you already have. And so it's a terrible situation to be in.
Well, with Funko, I'm just going to say this as someone who's collecting Funkos very heavy, probably about 5 to 10 years ago. I have no sympathy for them, because Funko has just saturated everything. It used to be something you had to go to certain places to get,
and you'd get an exclusive, like a Target exclusive, or this exclusive, or
but now it's like everywhere you go, there's an entire Funko section, and and it's just like, and then they're gouging you by coming up with different variants.
Right now, do you remember when you first met me? All the Funkos had on the shelf up here. And I don't even have them anymore, because it got to the point where I had to tell my family, stop getting me Funkos, because I got them for my birthday, I got them for Christmas. And,
exactly.
And the things I like, there's like 3 things I like, right? So I like anything Star Wars, anything Marvel, and then Ryu from Street Fighter. Those are my things. And those are the stuff that people would get me as gifts. And so I have now boxes and boxes and boxes of Funkos where I'm like, enough, stop the insanity. I don't have any more room. And there's no way you can display these things at some point in time where it doesn't look like you're a hoarder.
And it kills the novelty value. There's no longer any novelty in a Funko. It kills the novelty factor.
Because there's a Funko for everything now. Like we were just looking. My wife and I were in GameStop the other night. They have Funkos for McDonald's fries and McDonald's drinks, and I'm like, what the F? You know what I mean? Really, who's going to collect a freaking Funko Pop plastic statue of a thing of French fries? I mean, how much of a douchebag do you have to be to want to do that?
Well, the thing is, my thing is, I don't think of necessarily anybody being a fan of McDonald's. Like, does McDonald's have fans? It's just something you eat.
It's crap you eat because you're hungry, and it's quick and easy. You don't eat it because of the quality of the food.
A Funko is something that you bought because it was a Funko of something that you were a fan of.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I remember one of the first Funkos I bought. Well, actually, no. I'll even take this as something more recent. A rapper named Biz Markie who died a couple of years ago, and I was just really sad and hurt by that. I met Biz at a DJ shop in Manhattan, and he was a nice guy. And if you ever read stories from other people who knew him, other rappers, other celebrities, all of them always loved Biz and had great things to say. And when he died, I just felt terrible. And then, a few months ago, Funko came out with a Biz Markie Funko Pop, and I got that right away, because I have to have that was but because I have a certain feeling about the artist. That's why. Yeah.
And he's a real person, and most of the stuff we get Funko Pops on are fictional characters that don't really exist. Like I say, I've got so many Star Wars ones, and and Marvel
and different variants. Electrified Darth Vader,
right? The clear crystal one, or the gold-plated chrome-looking one, and all these other stuff like that. So
that kills the novelty factor.
Yeah, and honestly, to a degree, when Hasbro took over making Star Wars action figures in the '90s, they oversaturated the market too. There's so much Star Wars collectibles now. When I got back into Star Wars collecting in the late '90s, before my first daughter was going to be born, so I had a couple of years where I had a lot of money and not a lot of responsibility, and I bought the crap out of stuff.
Those weird Hasbro figures that were muscular. I remember those.
But there was the Power of the Force collection. There was the greenback and the redback cards, and there's so many of those that were out at that time. And then when Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace came out, and again, brand new Star Wars collectibles. This was like being a kid again for me, because I missed out. I didn't keep my Kenner action figures, so I'm like, I can buy brand new stuff, and I can get them, and I can collect them as an adult, and now I know not to open them and take care of them and all this kind of stuff. And even now, there's so much of that stuff. If you go to Collector's Comics, that all that stuff. It's cheap, even at a store that's selling them as collectibles and they're making a profit. You can buy that stuff cheap because there's so much of it. There's no value. The only value is in. Matter of fact, I don't know, Johnny Moe, if you're still out there. My good friend J.R. Morgan Productions, Johnny Moe, Movie Man. If you're still there, that Star Wars set I got for him, I got at Collector's Comics, and it had the Emperor and Luke and Darth Vader, like in a kind of a diorama set in the box with, and it looks kind of cool.
Collector's Comics.
But that wasn't that expensive either for being in really good condition. I bought it relatively inexpensively for something that's going on 30 years old. You would think new in box, old stock would be worth more than that, but it's just not, unfortunately. So I can't see Matter of fact, if one of the things to talk about in the article about burying the Funko Pops is they have so much stores, they have so many warehouses with millions and millions of units that they're having to spend money just on the storage and housing for these things. But if they could just hold on to this stuff for 20 or 30 years, then it becomes new old stock. And because I'm into retro computers and retro video games, whenever you can find new old stock on something that hasn't existed for 20 or 30 years, it is like the unicorn. It's the white whale. But when you got 40 million new old stock stuff, it's still, again, it's just the same oversaturation later on. But maybe they could make money, but they still have to store it somewhere.
But that becomes the issue. That's
Yeah.
how in comics they killed the speculator market in the 90s because that's why nobody at this point, if you're reading comic books, is because you enjoy reading them. You're not collecting them because you think none of those comics are gonna be worth anything because they print too many of them.
Yeah, just like movies now. There's so much. Yeah.
They're not. What made older comics worth money in the long run was that there weren't that many of them because everybody in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s their parents threw those things away, or they threw them away when they got to be a certain age. So it became hard to find a Spider-Man number, whatever.
Right. Because there were, God bless you, or there were literally only so many made. There was a finite number, and because of the lack of perceived value and the scarcity of how many were made and how many still exist, there is an intrinsic value there because they truly are rare. The word rare is so overused now, especially if you're into collecting old computers and old video game systems. They throw out rare and vintage on eBay all the time, and it's for those of us who are in the hobby, we kind of laugh when we see rare and vintage in air quotes. One of the things this article from Rap Pro that talks about how movies like Top Gun and Avatar: The Way of Water and even the Jurassic, whatever the hell that last Jurassic movie was called, how they did just as well as the quote-unquote superhero movie. I would still consider Top Gun something like a superhero movie or a super movie. It's still like the Top Gun Maverick was still kind of Star Warsy. It still had a lot of visual effects.
It does, but the thing is, it's, and I saw it when I posted this. I remember a lot of people were saying the same thing. But here's my issue. I'm not saying you're wrong. Here's my issue with that. It's sort of playing fast and loose with the rules because the article is making a clear point that these things are not. It's making a clear point that these things this past year, the two biggest hits weren't derived from characters from two major comic book publishers.
Right, Marvel and DC.
Yeah, right. They
which dominated forever.
And they're not derived from. They're both derived from IPs that were thought dead. They're still they're still IPs.
Yeah, okay, right, true.
Both,
it's almost like a phoenix rising from the ashes, right?
Yeah,
so these legacy sequels, the Jurassic Park legacy sequel that kind of very well meshed the old generation and the new generation in a story that did not feel contrived or crowbarred. It felt like these people were there at the right place for the right reason, not just to cash the cow, milk the cash cow. That makes sense. And Avatar again, Avatar is 99.9% all visual effects. The characters, the foregrounds, the backgrounds, the smoke particles, the dust, the water, almost everything you see there is CGI. It is basically a 3-hour video game, but it looks great and it's a great story. Here's the question: Can a movie, and it is almost impossible to have a movie without any visual effects, because visual effects are not just putting transformers and dinosaurs and superheroes. Visual effects have to do with just lighting and composition and changing the background and, matte paintings. And so there's a lot of movies that have visual effects that don't look like they're visual effects because it's just behind the actors, not in front of them or next to them. But is it possible to have movies that are not traditional VFX type movies be as successful? And successful isn't even necessarily about the dollars, but fan resonance and fandom and fan appreciation. Can a non-blockbuster movie do well and have the fans that like a Marvel or a Top Gun or an Avatar has, in your opinion?
I mean, theoretically, but here's the thing. I remember there's a movie called Kramer versus Kramer. I can't remember exactly what year it came, but I think it's late 70s.
About a divorce.
About a divorce. In fact, if you have a keyboard, let's look that up very fast, what year it came out.
Okay. Kramer versus Kramer.
I'm going to tell you why in a moment.
Kramer versus Kramer from Wikipedia, 1979. Dustin Hoffman, Meryl Streep, Justin Henry, Joe Beth Williams, Jane Alexander. Was Drew Barrymore in this one? Was she the child in the divorce? I don't remember. Or was that something else?
It perhaps was something else. But
okay.
But the point I'm making with it is
1979 is the year.
The point I'm making with it is this. It made 173 million. I don't know if that's worldwide or domestic. I'm thinking it's worldwide. But a movie about a divorce, not a movie about superheroes.
No car chases, no westerns.
A movie that was aimed at adults about an adult subject was one of the highest grossing films of its year. So it's not impossible. Does it spawn? Is something like this going to spawn a bunch of fans dressing like the characters? Of course not. Is it going to? Is it?
You've never been to a Kramer versus Kramer con?
No, but it's not. It's not meant to. It's not meant to cater to that sort of thing. Or if you want to go back even to two films I've mentioned multiple times in this podcast, The Godfather and The Exorcist. The Godfather was the highest grossing film of all time. Was the highest grossing film of all time when it was released. The box office says 430 to 517 million. It was the highest grossing film of all time when it was released. Now, the thing is, again, think about an R-rated film
about gangsters,
three-hour epic about that contains graphic violence
and became basically a trilogy.
That contains an explicit sex scene. That contains profanity.
Violence.
But
foul language.
But this is something.
What's not to like?
But this is something at the time that made, comparatively speaking, as much as a Marvel movie would today.
Right, adjust for inflation, et cetera, et cetera.
The Exorcist, which has some of the most vile things you will, especially if you're a Christian or if you believe in demonic possession and those sorts of things.
1973.
Again, box office 443 million. That's unadjusted. Think about that. An unadjusted figure. This thing. I mean, this is a movie where,
as of 2019,
this is a little girl. This is a movie where a 13-year-old girl. There was a graphic scene of her violently masturbating with a crucifix, stabbing herself in the crotch, and repeating something that I cannot repeat on this show.
No,
but
we will not take the Lord's name in vain that way on this program.
But this movie had people lined up around the block like it was Star Wars when it came out.
Yeah, in 1973, this was before Star Wars. But yeah, the times were different. Again, it has to do with quality, with that kind of time release. How often were big movies out? Not as often, which means they dominated the box office. They were in theaters longer. And word of mouth was mostly how things were said, and because there wasn't enough competition at the movie theater to dethrone some of these things, the theaters were going to continue to play the movie that people were still lining up to see year after year.
But it also shows how over the decades the idea of what a popular movie or a populist film, something aimed at a mass audience, can be, has kind of really shrank. It's kind of been.
Yeah,
it's become smaller.
The problem was with technology. Everybody wants bigger, better, faster more. Like we want a faster computer. We want faster internet. We want the latest iPhone. We want the bigger screen. We want the higher definition. We want the higher fidelity earbuds. Everything is more and more and more. I want bigger. I want better. I want faster. I want cheaper. I want more. I want to pay less, and I want it all the time. We have spoiled ourselves as a society. Technology continues to move forward. The quality of filmmaking, how technology empowers that filmmaking, continues to move forward. So again, it's going to become a bubble that can potentially burst. It sounds like between the headlines we're reading that Disney is looking at things. They are really trying to. They realize that they've just oversaturated us. So hopefully they're going to pull back. And hopefully they'll learn some of those lessons before they have a meltdown.
Well, the business model is not indefinitely, that they have now is not indefinitely sustainable. I was just watching a YouTube video about streaming platforms and how that's becoming a thing that corporate America is realizing this is not sustainable. The way streaming platforms have been doing business.
Right.
And let's use Disney Plus as an example, and let's use the godfather of them all, Netflix as an example.
Yeah.
In recent years, both of these platforms have been basically doing these very expensive streaming shows. A season of The Mandalorian costs about as much as one huge blockbuster that did. One season of The Mandalorian cost about as much as a Star Wars movie would.
Right.
And again, I've mentioned this on the show before. A movie, you tally the money by admissions. For each pair of eyes.
Right. For each ticket sold.
Yeah, each pair of eyes is a ticket sold in that theater, unless people are sneaking in.
Right.
Which is not as easy today as it was before.
Right.
Now
you can have 10 people in the same house watching it for one $15 a month subscription.
Right.
So there's more eyes per dollar.
So how exactly are they making money? Like that's not sustainable. And I think we're going to see a lot of shrinking going on because the way they're doing business.
Right.
Because the whole appeal of Netflix was you have in one space, in one spot, on one channel or service, whatever you want to call it, it was a catch-all for all of these films. It was like having Blockbuster at your fingertips.
Right.
And you didn't have, unlike HBO or Showtime or Cinemax, you didn't have to sit there and wait for them to show it, and then you had
and wait for a certain time. It was on demand.
It was on demand. Now that was the appeal, but now what's happened is things have changed. Now a lot of Disney and these other studios, they want their own streaming platform, so they're pulling their content from Netflix to just show exclusively. And so when you're paying for all these different streaming networks,
the nice thing was in the early days what we called cutting the cord or cord cutting. You got rid of the cable company. You're just using internet. Because it used to be you're paying $50 a month for internet, and then you're paying 100 or maybe multiple hundreds of dollars for cable with all the premium channels and all the stuff that 90% of nobody watched. So average person was paying $200 a month for internet and cable. So now you get rid of cable. So now you got your $50 internet plan. Okay. So I've saved.
And Netflix was a big part of that.
And Netflix at one point in time was like $8-9 a month, $8.99. So now I'm paying not $100 or $200. Now I'm paying $60 per month. So, and I'm watching Netflix, and life is good. But again, this is the bigger, better, faster, more. I need more. Well, half the stuff on that, again, it's like half the stuff on Netflix I don't really like, and then I kind of want this and I want that, and it's never good enough. We are just a society of people that's never going to be happy.
And now we're in a situation where, okay, you cut the whole. Netflix was one of the big pushes for people to cut the cord. People were saying, why do I need cable when I have internet and Netflix?
And if I add up all the bills of all the streaming services that I'm actually paying for now, I'm paying
more
just
than
as much
cable
as if I had cable, right?
Actually, it's more than cable ever was. It's more than cable ever was.
So the only benefit is you have the on-demand, the immediacy, and like the built-in DVR and all that kind of stuff where remember when we used to have cable boxes and we were getting ready to get rid of cable boxes? My wife's like, I've got hundreds of hours stored in that DVR, in that cable box, and I need to watch all this before we can turn it in. I'm like, bitch, you need to start watching because, the more I hold on to this stuff, the more I got to pay for it. I'm trying to get this crap out of here. So, yeah, but now the DVR's in the cloud, so you don't, it's all virtual. It's an interesting paradigm shift on how that's going. So there are movies that don't contain Spider-Man, the Hulk, Captain America, Batman, Superman that are still doing well at the box office. To me, these are still kind of super-ish movies because they are fantastical. They're still blockbustery. They're still very visual effectsy, but they're not directly superhero related. In a worst-case scenario, like let's say Devil's Advocate, that bubble bursts and all these studios go out of business and there's no new content. We are now in a sci-fi fantasy apocalypse where it's over. How would we survive? Short answer for me is I'm still very nostalgic. I like watching old stuff. I would just continue to watch old stuff as long as we had access to it. So I would still be nostalgic for and wanting to watch the olds and the classics. What would you do if there was an apocalypse and there was no more new sci-fi fantasy content?
I mean, of course, having nothing new would always be a problem. But if that would have happened, I mean, there's so much stuff that I haven't seen.
Right.
From
It
past
gives you
eras.
time. That's the problem too. Is
You
there's
know.
so many choices. I can spend an hour and a half trying to find something to watch on Netflix. Where if I just pressed play on one of them, I could actually been watching something. I'll spend so much time surfing through cover art on something to watch that it kind of defeated the purpose. We are oversaturated in so many different ways. At some point in time, it just got really big. It ballooned out. It needs to kind of right size. It needs to kind of come
But
back.
that's what a crash is about, basically.
Yeah.
It's a self-correcting.
Yeah, well,
Self-correcting
before
measure.
hopefully it will right size and deflate before it bursts, and hopefully all these analysts and everybody else who's tracking all this stuff will figure out a way to do that. Yeah, it's an interesting time that we're in. It's a good time. It's a good problem to have that there's so much content, but it's a problem because there's so much content. You know,
Well, here's what I predict. I'm going to end the show on this because we've been going for an hour. I think this is a good place to kind of, bring it to a close. But I believe.
that children are the future.
Well, that's not just I believe. That's just the truth. But I believe that
I believe I can fly.
we're going to see these streaming networks are going to start. They're going to start downsizing. They're going to start changing the way that they've been spending and the way they've been doing business. We're going to also see. I think this is inevitable. I don't think there's any way around it. We're going to. Marvel now is going to go into a bit of a slump, and we're going to see bigger and bigger examples of that. And
Okay.
we're going to eventually hear Kevin Feige announce a bigger course correction than a little relatively minor course corrections he's been announcing. We're going to see him announcing something much bigger. I think we're going to see something new. Again, that's sort of like what we're into, but not
a
what we're into.
revisionist version of what
Yeah.
we're currently used to.
And and I think that's going to be what rules the roost, and it's going to give us a problem. We're going to be slow to accept it.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things. So another thing. Let's say all the new content dries up. What would we do with our time besides catching up on a back catalog of so much content? I would hope that this time that we spent consuming and being passive, that some of the geeky, creative, nerdy people would actually start to spend that time. Let me come up with the next big thing. Let me start to write a story. Let me develop a character. Let me develop a comic. Let me work on my idea for a novel or a screenplay or a script. And let me be the next Spielberg or the next George Lucas. And let me just work on something new that we haven't had, because now instead of me spending 8 hours a night binging a bunch of crap and that crap's no longer there, let me make my own crap up. It's amazing what you do. They say that necessity is the mother of invention. And when you got nothing else to do with your time, when you can no longer sit on your ass and just hit the old clicker and channel surf, well, if there's no channels to surf, what am I going to do? Well, I can read a book, or maybe I can write a book. Maybe I can stretch my imagination. Maybe we can get together and come up with a writer's circle, and we can all brainstorm on creating a new story, a new idea, and pitch things and kind of workshop stuff. That's what I would hope people would do. If they had less time to consume crap, they could devote some of that time to create new stuff that maybe isn't as crappy as all the crap we've been consuming so far. That would be nice. But one thing I do say, what I do like about this episode, I know we're now just beating the horse, but I like that we just didn't talk about the latest show that we watched. This was a good topic to chew on. This was not just another review. However, I will say, though, I have finished the entire season of Last of Us. Love it. Gotta watch it. You gotta catch up. We can talk about The Last of Us.
I gotta catch up.
I'm caught up on both episodes of The Mandalorian. Loving that. And Star Trek Picard Season 3. Loving that. So there's some good content out there right now. Before that bubble bursts, I'm going to be taking my straw and absorbing as much of that bubble juice as I can. But there's some really good content out right now. Love The Last of Us. Can't wait to play the game when it comes out on PC. And Picard and Mandalorian are both pleasantly surprising as well. Are just pleasant. I'm not that I'm surprised that they're pleasant, but I'm enjoying the hell out of them. All right, we're going to put a fork in this episode, Mr. Wilson?
Yeah, I think it's...
All right, so to not be ironic, we don't want to oversaturate you with this episode of talking about how much oversaturation has been happening in the marketplace. So I'll just say send us feedback to our email address, which is show@culturegoespop.com, and check us out on the web, culturegoespop.com, for links to all the places we are on the interwebs. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for listening.